Today, the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy, is live from Darwin. Welcome back, Mal. And from Brisbane,
hello.
Shadow Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Holly Hughes. Holly, great to have you back too. Why don't we start in your portfolio area then, Holly Hughes? We've got this, Mark 10 version of climate and energy policy. Well, more energy policy, isn't it, coming forward in this capacity mechanism. Do you think it should be widely supported by the relevant governments around the states and territories?
Look, it's important that the capacity mechanism doesn't try to interfere with the market in a way that sees coal and gas being penalised. And we have seen a push for only new types of technologies, new types of power only being supported through this. And that will in fact distort the market and lead to more problems. We know last week a lot of the problems that we saw around getting power supply through was not that there was not enough dispatchable power, it was when AEMO put the cap of $300 on that meant generators were no longer putting that power supply into the market, particularly at a time when they would normally be getting around $15,000 per megawatt hour, yet it was capped at $300
But
per megawatt hour.
Whose fault is that though, Holly? I mean, they responded by withdrawing because the cap was put on, but the cap was only put on because the prices had rocketed.
Well, we can go back and have a look at why the prices have rocketed, and that would be because there's been very little investment in around coal-fired power generation, and that has also occurred because there's been a lack of access to finance to maintain the power plants. There's also been issues around the demonisation of coal and gas. We've got current Energy Minister Chris Bowen saying that gas-led recovery is BS, that it's an investment, it's a fraud to invest in gas. Those sorts of comments have done nothing to support the industry. But let's also be I'm sitting here in Brisbane, it's the Queensland government that owns the coal generators here in Queensland, and they were just as culpable putting that power supply or not putting that power supply in as private companies. And private companies are there to make a profit for their shareholders. So if they are having to put power in at below cost, well, of course, that's not going to be very attractive to them.
Yeah, a lot of people were making the argument last week, Malarndirri McCarthy, that ownership didn't really become the central issue. It was more the conduct of the market itself. But a more general question to you, Mal, do you think there is a way forward here, some sort of compromise? Because maybe not so much where you were, but certainly down the east coast of Australia, last week really sharpened the minds about what an energy crisis looks like.
Well, it certainly was very real, wasn't it, Greg? And it raised the stakes in terms of what the Albanese government has to do in order to step in to work on an area that perhaps should have been worked on a lot sooner in the last coalition government, if you like. And clearly with Chris Bowen now calling the state and territory ministers together, they do have to work together even more now. And I know that when they did meet last week, they did come out, obviously not with the silver bullet that we all would like, but they have got some steps in ways forward.
Yep. Why don't we move on, because we have been discussing energy for decades in this country, and we probably will for a while longer. There's a bit of other ground to cover. And Julian, Assange, Mel, we might start with you first of all. Should Australia be working, particularly with the US, but maybe also the UK, particularly with the Biden administration, to seek some resolution to this that would not have him extradited on espionage charges?
Sorry, Greg, who did you want to go to? You didn't tell us.
Sorry, for Malarndirri McCarthy. Take it away, Mal.
Thank you. Look, it's certainly been clear in our view that, the case with Mr Assange has certainly dragged on for way too long, Greg, and clearly, as the Prime Minister has said on a number of occasions, that there is conversations going on, and there should be, in terms of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and what is open to Mr Assange and his team, but this has gone on for way too long. And
is that a shift? I mean, I detect a shift, Malarndirri, in emphasis on that since this government changed?
Look, clearly we are very concerned. We've certainly watched this over the many years that it's gone on, but I do think, and I'd like to see, certainly when we go back to Parliament at the end of July and find out with my colleagues what our steps will be going forward. There has to be something here. This has gone on way too long.
And Holly, what's your view on all of this? Obviously not much succor was given by preceding coalition governments, but we are at an inflection point now legally, aren't we? What should happen?
Well, Mr Assange, the reason this has gone on, has been involved in legal processes and fighting the extradition, including when he took refuge in the embassy for a number of years. But I perhaps take a slightly different view when it comes to Mr Assange than some of the Twitterati, if you like. The damage that was done, and certainly the feeling that comes from those that have served our country in the Defence Forces, those that have worked on national security, have a very strong view about Mr Assange and the danger that he potentially put a number of Australians and others in through the release of those documents. Now, we don't know the extent of who and how many were put at risk and what the consequences were, but there were consequences, and there are those factors to be considered as well, because it was a breach of US law. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think you do have to face up to the law that you are and breaking the law that you're charged with.
Right. What about the argument that says the original, you know, leaker or the person who obtained the leaks and handed them to WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, had her sentence commuted? Doesn't that cast a different light on the argument?
Well, her sentence was commuted, but she did face a trial, she did face a court of law, and she was imprisoned. Mr Assange hasn't been through that process, and potentially if he does go to the US, go through that process, and then that would be a matter for the US government. Mr Albanese has said today that he would prefer to use soft diplomacy, and I think that is absolutely the right course. I don't think that will appease the people that are out there screaming up and down that we need to somehow bring Mr Assange home immediately. That's not going to happen anyway. There's still legal processes underway with him appealing this extradition. So that's not going to happen. If Mr Albanese is using soft diplomacy, it's not going to be on the front page of the paper. So we are probably not going to know what's happening until it happens.
All right. Can I take you, Malarndirri McCarthy, to something that's very sensitive and, of course, distressing whenever it receives public attention? I'm talking about state care, child protection regimes run by the states and territories. Yet more, you know, terrible cases coming to light on some ABC reporting today through your interest, in fact, responsibilities these days for Indigenous communities. What do you think should be done? Is there a national role in response to this?
Well, we certainly know in First Nations areas, Greg, that more Indigenous children are removed than we've ever seen in so many decades. We also know the history. We look at the stolen generations and the redress that's still ongoing in terms of their treatment in the care of others, whether it be the churches or foster homes and families. So listening to the stories that I heard this morning, listening to AM and ABC News, none of it surprised me, sadly. And I think that's the biggest disappointment here, that this isn't new. This is not new. There are families across this country who've known this for a very long time, and I certainly, even in my role previously here in the Northern Territory Government as Children and Families Minister, had to take action in terms of the removal of children and look into what it was in the lives of our families that are creating such despair that gives the reason for their removal in the first place.
Would you and the Albanese
government
government
that has to be done.
Yeah, just would you and the Albanese government, you know, seek to elevate this as a subject for discussion?
Sure. Look, what I've certainly heard in terms of Minister Dreyfus and Minister Rushworth, they have reached out to the National Children's Commissioner, which is the right thing to do. I would certainly like to look at this in terms of my role as Assistant Minister in Indigenous Affairs around the care of children, Indigenous children. And, you know, we have organisations like SNAKE, the Secretariat for National and Aboriginal Islander Childcare, who are working with this on a daily basis. So we do need to move on this much sooner, and I certainly am pleased to hear that my colleagues are doing that.
And Holly, obviously these things are never easy, certainly not easy for governments to manage once the intervention has occurred, but would you observe that they are broken systems or just systems that can be improved?
Look, I mean, those stories this morning were just horrific, and it would have to be inhuman for them not to break your heart and to think that children are ever put into those circumstances. So, we need to look at why so many children are going into care in the first place, but then what's happening through those care systems as well. Look, it was only on the weekend, a long weekend we had a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to someone, we were out in Moree, about how it had moved to a situation that the people that were then in charge of going to do home visits for particularly young mothers in Indigenous communities, that if they walked into the house and saw the mother giving the baby a bottle with Coke in it, unless the mother asked for nutrition advice, they weren't allowed to say anything. So I think in some ways we've kind of created a rod for our own back in trying to overly politically correct how we deal with some situations, how we help particularly young mothers better raise their children and understand some of the things that they can do that will help their children moving forward. But we do, I think, need to have a really honest conversation about this, because the state and territories are not doing what they're supposed to. The state and territories, it was openly admitted that they're basically manipulating within the department the statistics of what cases are opened but what cases are actually being reviewed, and it's only when a child's life is lost do we start to see some action, and that is unacceptable. So we really do need to expect more, but I think we need to review some of the processes around it so that we can get back to really being able to offer care and support rather than working within some ridiculous political correct parameters.
Sure thing. Terrible situation. One final observation I might just get, just on the Senate numbers, since you both are senators. Mel McCarthy, Labor within a whisker of an outright majority, 38, and you've got options to get to 39. The pep must have come back in the step a bit when that news came through today.
Well, look, we're pretty thrilled, Greg. There's no two ways about it, and obviously very excited about our new Senator-elect in WA, Fatima, who I'm looking forward to meeting.
Yep.
But certainly commend her for being able to join us.
Yep.
I think it's wonderful news.
And does that make the loss feel, even harsher, Holly? the realisation that you're back down to 32.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back and have a look at the numbers. From what I looked at, the coalition's still got the biggest block of senators, but it's the Labor Party with the Greens and one crossbencher.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right.
So it's actually not the Labor Party getting there on their own. They're still, I think, around 26. Is that
exactly.
Right?
I should have clarified.
Yeah.
I'm counting them as a block because it just may work occasionally like that.
Well, if they're going to be a coalition, then they should be honest with the Australian people and say this is our majority in the Senate.
Fair enough.
And I think it's up to how the ALP is going to deal with the Greens. We've seen Adam Batt having a bit of a dummy spit this morning that he hasn't been spoken to. So anyway, we'll see how that plays out.
We might have discussed that, but time has
Senator
beaten
Hughes
us.
is getting ready.
Yeah, Holly.
Sorry, what was that?
I think we'll leave it there. We're going to run out of time. Holly Hughes and Malarndirri McCarthy, thanks so much for joining us in a
Thanks, Greg.
bit of a spirited discussion right at the end. Perhaps we should have stayed.